Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Looking at things today, it seems like everyone's trying to make sense of what's happening in Ukraine and how it all fits into this, global power struggle.
Yeah, it's certainly a complicated situation, lots of moving parts, but I think we can break it down and, maybe shed some light on what's really going on.
Well, let's start with the elephant in the room, right? The US and Russia seem to be well on their way to, patching things up, which honestly surprised a lot of people, especially in Europe.
Right. It's a pretty big shift from the policies of the, previous administration. A lot of folks were expecting more of the same, but things have definitely taken a turn.
So let's dive into that. What's driving this change? Is it just President Trump, doing his America First thing? Or is there something bigger at play?
Well, I think it's a combination of factors. President Trump is definitely, putting America's interests first, but he's also a pragmatist. He sees the world as it is, not as he wishes it would be.
So he's not afraid to shake things up, even if it ruffles some feathers?
Exactly. And, when you look at the situation in Ukraine, it's clear that the old approach wasn't working.
You're saying the previous administration's policies were actually making things worse?
Well, I wouldn't say they were making things worse, but they weren't really helping either. All that talk about standing up to Russia and supporting Ukraine, it just led to more tension and more conflict.
And a lot of money and resources poured into a war that seems impossible to win.
Right. And for what? The reality is that Russia has the upper hand in this conflict. And any lasting peace will likely involve Ukraine, making some concessions.
You're talking about territorial concessions, right? Giving up some land to Russia.
Probably, yeah. It's not ideal, but it's the most likely outcome. And frankly, it's probably the better outcome for everyone involved.
Including Ukraine.
Yeah, even Ukraine. Look, they've been fighting this war for years now, and they're no closer to victory. And, the longer it goes on, the more they stand to lose.
But what about the Ukrainian people? Don't they have a right to determine their own future?
Of course they do, but they also have a right to peace and security. And right now, those things seem pretty far off.
So you're saying that sometimes, peace requires compromise, even if it means giving up something you believe is rightfully yours.
Sometimes, yeah, it's not always easy, but it's the reality of the world we live in.
It's definitely a tough pill to swallow, but I guess the alternative is even worse. So where does the current Ukrainian president fit into all of this?
Well, he's a bit of a wild card. He's resisting calls for negotiations from both the U.S. and Russia, and he seems determined to cling to power no matter the cost.
Which is kind of ironic, considering he came to power promising to end the war.
Right. It seems like he's more interested in his own political survival than in the well-being of his people.
It's a sad situation all around. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about this whole globalist agenda that people keep mentioning.
Yeah, it's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but people don't always understand what it really means.
So what does it mean? Is it some kind of conspiracy theory?
Well, there are definitely some conspiracy theories out there, but at its core, the globalist agenda is really about promoting international cooperation and integration.
So things like the European Union and the United Nations.
Exactly. Organizations that seek to transcend national borders and create a more interconnected world.
And what's wrong with that? I mean, doesn't that sound like a good thing?
Well, in theory it does, but the problem is that it often comes at the expense of national sovereignty and identity. People start to feel like they're losing control over their own lives in their own countries.
And that's where the backlash comes in, right? People feeling like they're being overrun by global forces that they can't control.
Exactly. And you see this happening all over the world. The rise of nationalism, the pushback against immigration, the rejection of global trade deals, it's all part of the same trend.
So how does Russia fit into all of this?
Well, Russia is kind of the anti-globalist, right? They're fiercely independent, they have a strong national identity, and they're not afraid to stand up to the West.
So they're seen as a threat to this, global order that the elites are trying to create.
In a way, yes, Russia represents a different way of doing things, a way that challenges the assumptions of the globalist project.
Which is probably why there's so much tension between Russia and the West, right? It's not just about Ukraine. It's about two competing visions for the future.
Exactly. It's a clash of ideologies, a struggle for power and influence, and it's playing out on a global stage.
And Europe is caught right in the middle of it.
Yeah, Europe is in a tough spot. They're trying to balance their relationship with the U.S. with their dependence on Russia for energy and trade.
And now with President Trump shaking things up, they're not sure what to do.
Right. He's pulling back from Europe, focusing on America's own interests, and that's leaving a vacuum that other powers like Russia and China are eager to fill.
So you're saying that President Trump's actions are actually accelerating the decline of Europe?
Well, I wouldn't say he's intentionally trying to weaken Europe, but his policies are definitely having that effect. The EU and NATO were already facing some serious challenges before he came along, and now they're really starting to unravel.
So what does the future hold for Europe?
It's hard to say, but I think we're going to see a lot more fragmentation and instability in the years to come.
And what about the U.S.? What's President Trump's endgame here?
Well, I think he wants to make America great again, right? And that means putting America's interests first, reducing foreign entanglements, and focusing on domestic issues.
So he's basically turning his back on the world.
Not exactly, but he's definitely redefining America's role in the world. He's not interested in being the world's policeman anymore. He's more focused on making deals and protecting American jobs and businesses.
So it's all about America first,
Pretty much, yeah.
which is a pretty big departure from the way things have been done in the past.
It is, but I think it's a necessary correction. America can't afford to keep propping up the rest of the world while its own people are struggling.
So what you're saying is that President Trump is trying to create a new world order, one where America is still a major player, but it's not the only player.
Exactly. He's recognizing that the world has changed and America needs to adapt if it wants to stay ahead of the game.
So it's a more realistic approach to foreign policy.
I think so, yeah.
So if this new world order does come to pass, what will it look like?
Well, I think it will be a multipolar world one where power is more evenly distributed among different countries and regions.
So not just the U.S. calling the shots.
Right. It'll be a more complex world, more unpredictable, more dangerous in some ways.
But also more opportunity for countries like China and Russia to assert themselves.
Exactly. And for countries like India and Brazil to emerge as major players.
So a more balanced world.
In a way, yes, but also a more competitive world.
And where does Europe fit into all of this?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? If Europe wants to remain relevant in this new world order, they're going to have to get their act together.
What do you think?
They need to resolve their internal divisions, they need to strengthen their economies, and they need to develop a more coherent foreign policy.
And they need to do it fast.
Absolutely. The world is moving quickly, and Europe can't afford to be left behind.
It's a lot to think about. It's like this whole Ukraine situation is just the tip of the iceberg, right?
It is, yeah. It's a symptom of a much larger shift that's taking place in the world.
A shift in power, a shift in ideology, a shift in the very way we think about the world.
Exactly. It's a fascinating time to be alive, that's for sure.
And a scary time, too.
Maybe a little bit of both.
Well, one thing's for certain. This is just the beginning of the story.
Oh, yeah. We're in for a wild ride.
I just hope we can all hold on.
Me too.
Thanks for taking the time to break all this down for us. It's been really helpful.
My pleasure. Anytime.
And to all of our listeners out there, stay tuned. We'll be back soon with more deep dives into the most important issues of our time.
Makes you wonder, right? Like, is this the end of globalism as we know it?
Yeah, and what comes next? Is it like every country for themselves kind of thing?
It's interesting, though, for all the talk about Russia being aggressive, they've actually been pretty restrained, especially considering their economy. They could have really taken advantage of Europe's financial woes, but they haven't.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe we need to rethink this whole narrative about Russia being this big expansionist threat.
It's worth considering, right? Like, are they really the bad guys here? Or is it more complicated than that?
Well, what about all those reports of, atrocities and war crimes committed by Russian forces?
There have been accusations, yeah. But you got to remember, information is a weapon in these kinds of conflicts. It's hard to know what to believe.
So you're saying we should be skeptical of everything we hear?
Pretty much, yeah. You got to take everything with a grain of salt and try to look at things from multiple perspectives.
So how do we do that? How do we figure out what's really going on?
It's not easy, that's for sure. You got to do your research, check your sources, and be willing to question your own biases.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It is, but it's important. We can't just blindly accept what we're told. We need to think critically and form our own opinions.
Well, I guess that's why we're doing this deep dive, right? To try to make sense of it all.
Exactly. We're here to help you connect the dots and see the bigger picture.
So let's get back to Ukraine for a minute. You mentioned this idea of a neutral Ukraine modeled after Austria. How realistic is that?
It's a long shot, but it's not impossible. The key would be getting everyone on board, the US, Russia, Europe, and of course, Ukraine itself.
But you were saying earlier that Europe's kind of falling apart, right? So how could they even agree on something like that?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? The EU is facing some serious internal divisions, and they're not exactly in a strong position to be making demand.
But wouldn't a neutral Ukraine be in their best interest? I mean, it would create a buffer between them and Russia?
In theory, yes. But you got to remember, the EU is heavily influenced by the US. And the U.S. has its own agenda.
Which is?
Well, the U.S. wants to weaken Russia, right? And they see Ukraine as a key part of that strategy.
So a neutral Ukraine wouldn't really fit into that plan?
Not really, no. It would take away a lot of their leverage over Russia.
So it seems like Ukraine is caught in the middle of this power struggle.
They are, and it's a dangerous place to be.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about how nationalism is on the rise in Europe. Do you think that makes a neutral Ukraine more likely or less likely?
It's hard to say nationalism is a complex phenomenon. It can be a force for both good and bad.
How so?
Well, on the one hand, it can lead to greater independence and self-reliance, but on the other hand, it can also lead to isolationism and xenophobia.
So it's a double-edged sword.
Exactly, and it's hard to predict which way it will swing.
Well, let's hope it swings in the right direction, because the world needs less conflict, not more.
I agree with that.
So let's talk about China for a bit. They seem to be pretty quiet about all of this. What's their game?
Oh, they're paying attention. Don't worry about that. They're just playing the long game.
What do you mean?
They're watching the West tear itself apart, and they're waiting for the right moment to make their move.
So they're biding their time.
Exactly. They're not going to get involved in someone else's fight. They're too smart for that.
So what are they waiting for?
They're waiting for the U.S. to overextend itself. They're waiting for Europe to collapse. And they're waiting for the global economy to tank.
And then what?
Then they'll swoop in and pick up the pieces.
So they're like the vultures circling overhead, just waiting for the carcass to die.
That's a bit harsh. But yeah, that's basically their strategy.
It's kind of scary when you think about it.
It is, but it's the reality of the world we live in. The strong prey on the weak. It's always been that way.
So what can we do about it?
Not much, to be honest. We're just small players in a big game.
So we're doomed.
Not necessarily, but we need to be realistic about our options, and we need to be prepared for a long and difficult struggle.
Okay, well, that's not exactly encouraging, but at least we're aware of the situation.
That's the first step, right? Awareness is key.
Well, I guess that's why we're doing this deep dive, to try to understand what's really going on and to share that knowledge with others.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, and the more we know, the better equipped we'll be to face the challenges ahead.
Well said. So let's keep digging and see what else we can uncover.
I'm game, if you are.
All right, let's do it. Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around, right?
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of complicated situations, we got to talk about the Middle East.
Oh, boy. Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms, right?
Seriously, like where do you even begin with that? It's like a never-ending soap opera with like 1,000 different plot lines all happening at once.
And every character has their own agenda, you know? It's all about power and influence and who's going to come out on top.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. So how does President Trump even approach something like that? I mean, does he even have a strategy?
I think he does. It's just different from what we're used to, you know? He's not afraid to break with tradition, and he's definitely not afraid to piss people off.
So what's his game plan?
Well, for one thing, he's not interested in nation building, you know, like trying to spread democracy or whatever. That's not his priority.
So what is his priority?
Stability, I think he wants to make sure that the oil keeps flowing and that the region doesn't erupt into a full-blown war.
So it's all about American interests, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. He's not going to waste time and resources on things that don't directly benefit the U.S.
He's taking a more hands-off approach.
In a way, yeah. But he's also willing to use force when he deems it necessary. You know, like with that whole Iran situation.
Right. So he's not afraid to get his hands dirty, but he's not going to go looking for a fight either.
Exactly. He's trying to strike a balance between protecting American interests and avoiding unnecessary conflict.
It's a tough line to walk.
It is, but I think he's doing a pretty good job so far.
Time will tell, I guess.
Yeah. Only time will tell.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Ukraine, Russia, China, the Middle East. It's like the whole world is in a state of flux.
It is. It's a really interesting time to be alive. You know, things are changing so rapidly, and it's hard to predict what's going to happen next.
It's exciting and scary all at the same time.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But it's important to stay informed, right? That's why we're doing this deep dive, to try to make sense of it all.
Absolutely. The more we know, the better equipped we'll be to navigate these turbulent times.
All said. Well, that's all the time we have for today, but we'll be back soon with more deep dives into the biggest stories shaping our world.
Until then, stay curious and stay engaged.
Thanks for joining us. And remember, subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day,